Lesson 23, I will add and multiply unit fractions to build fractions greater than 1 using visual models. So remember, a unit fraction is a fraction that has 1 over something. So 1/4 would be a unit fraction. So we're going to add unit fractions, we're going to multiply unit fractions, and all to build a fraction that's greater than 1. So say, for example, we may end up with 6/4 by the time we add and multiply. So we're going to be making fractions that are greater than 1 by multiplying unit fractions, okay? Go ahead and get out your journal today, and I want you to go ahead and label it with today's date, and I want you to go ahead and head it Lesson 23, Multiply Unit Fractions. We're not going to put a whole lot in our math journal today, but we are going to put a couple of examples of some problems in our math journal. So the first thing I want you to do is in your math journal, I want you to write 6 times 2 as an addition sentence showing 6 groups of 2. So basically we're showing 6 times 2 using repeated addition. And that would look like this. I want you to write this number sentence in your math journal. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. This is 6 2's using repeated addition. We've been doing a lot of this with fractions. We've been saying 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 6/4. Okay? Now, underneath this number sentence that you just wrote, I want you to draw a number line to show 6 2's. So that's going to look like this. You're going to start with 0, and then you're going to go from 0 to 12, and you're just going to jump 6 groups of 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 groups of 2 to show that 6 times 2 equals 12. Now I know that we've been talking about fractions, and I promise that this actually is going somewhere. Once you get finished drawing this number line, I want you to go ahead and press play, and we'll move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to transition. Instead of saying 6 times 2, let's think of this as 6 times a half. So I want you to write a number sentence this time using repeated addition to show 6 groups of 1/2. Like this. This is unit fractions. We have 6 halves is the same as 6 over 2, which is 6 halves. Now we're going to draw a number line to show 6 halves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw my number line. My number line is going to go from 0 to 6 halves. So I've got 0 here, and I've got 6 halves here. So I'm dividing these into halves. So I've got 6 halves. This would be 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves. Okay? So you would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 halves. Just like we did with our 2's. 6 times 2 equals 12. Well, 6 times a half equals 6 halves. All right? So let's get to how this is going to affect what we're doing today. Now let's think about taking our unit sentence, our unit fractions, okay? You should have this written. You should have 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. Now, I want you to go back to this same number sentence right here. And what we're going to do is we are going to draw parentheses around groups that will make a whole. How many halves does it take to make a whole? Well, it takes 2 halves. So I want you to come back and I want you to draw parentheses like this. So this will be 1 whole, this will be 1 whole, and this will be 1 whole, because this will be 2 halves, 2 halves, 2 halves. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. So that's basically what we have here. 6 times 1/2 is equal to 1/2 plus 1/2, 1/2 plus 1/2, 1/2 plus 1/2. So here's my 6 halves. All right, so let's think about this for just a second. So we can think of this as being 2 halves 3 times, or 3 times 2 halves. 3 times 2 halves is the same thing as 3 wholes. Here's my 2 halves. 2 halves, 2 halves, 2 halves. So I have 3 times 2 halves. Well, 2 halves is 1 whole. So I've got 1, 2, 3. So 3 times 2 halves is the same as 3. So 6 times 1/2 is the same thing as 3 times 2 halves. Okay? All right, so because 6 times 2 halves, I want you to draw one more number line for me. And I want you to draw one just like this. So we're going to start with 0, and we're going to go to 3. So I want you to go ahead and divide this into thirds. 1, 2, 3. And then you can see we put a little dot here to show halves, or you could do like this to show a half. And then we're going to show this would be 2 halves, 2 halves, 2 halves. So there are 3 groups of 2 halves. So 6 times 1 half is equal to 3. Now, I know this looks like a big mess here, but do not write this. Just look at this with me for a minute. So 6 halves, which is 6 halves, is the same as 3 times 2 halves. Now, why did I say 3 times 2 and not 2 times 3? Well, the reason why I said 3 times 2 halves is because I was looking for 2 halves. 2 halves makes a whole. And that's what we're going to be trying to do today. And I know this sounds a little bit complicated, but bear with me. Today, whenever we are making these unit fractions, we're going to be trying to make whole numbers, because when we make whole numbers, it's easier to solve. Okay? So how many groups of 2 halves are in 6 halves? There would be 3 groups of 2 halves, or 3 wholes. Okay? All right, let's practice this a little bit in our problem set. Now, I promise, as we go along, this will start to become a little bit more clear to you. I know that all of that we just did was a little bit confusing, but it was important. That's why I want you to go ahead and do it. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our problem set today. And first, we're just going to practice counting by thirds. We're going to start at 0 thirds, and we're going to end at 6 thirds. So we have 0 thirds, 1 third, 2 thirds, 3 thirds, 4 thirds, 5 thirds, and 6 thirds. Now it says circle any fractions that are equivalent to a whole number. You can see they circled this because 0 thirds is equal to 3. Well, what would be the next one that would be equal to a whole number? Well, 3 thirds is equal to 1. And 6 thirds would be equal to 2. All right, now let's practice counting by halves, starting at 0 halves. Okay, so let's start with 0 halves. So I've got 0 halves, 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves, 8 halves. So now I want you to pause the video, and I want you to try to go through and circle all of these fractions that are equal to a whole number. So press pause, circle all the ones you think are equal to a whole number, and then come back and let's see if we agree. Okay, so hopefully you circled 0 halves because that's equal to 0. 2 halves is equal to 1. 4 halves is equal to 2. 6 halves is equal to 3. And 8 halves would be equal to 4. All right, now let's take a look at this unit fraction here. We have all of these fourths. It says use parentheses to show how to make ones. Well, if these are fourths, how many fourths does it take to make 1? It would take 4 fourths, right? So we're going to put parentheses around 4 fourths. 1, 2, 3, 4 fourths is 1 whole. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this will be 1, 1, 1, which is equal to 3. Okay, we're going to use all of these strategies today when we are multiplying our unit fractions to make a fraction that's greater than 1 whole. All right, now we're going to multiply as shown below. Draw a number line to support your answer. So I want you to take a look at what they did. Remember how I said we're looking to make a whole. So since we're multiplying by 1/3, we thought, well, we can take 6 and we can break it into 3 and 3, because 3 1/3 is 3 thirds, which is equal to 1 whole. Okay? That's why they did this. This is why they said 3 times 1/3 And 3 times 1/3 is the same thing as 2 times 3/3, which is equal to 2. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. We have halves. How many halves does it take to make a whole? It takes 2 halves. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have 0, and then we're going to count by halves. 1 half, this will be 0 halves. And then we're going to say 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves. I'm not really sure how far I'm going to have to go, but I'm pretty sure that's far enough because I've only got 6 halves, so this should be good. So I want to make a whole, right? So it's going to take 2 of these halves to make a whole. So 2 times 1 half. That's 2. Okay, I've got to get 6. This will be 2 more. 2 times 1 half. This is 2 4 halves. Now I want to make another whole. So I'm going to say 2 times 1 half. So I have 2 4 6. Here's my 6. So I have 6 times 1 half is the same thing as, how many times do I have 2 halves? I have it 1, 2, 3. It's the same thing as 3 times 2 halves, which is the same thing as 3 wholes. I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, bear with me if that's confusing. Let's see if it starts to make more sense as we go along. All right, so now we've got 12 times 1/4. So I know I'm going to need at least 12 fourths. So I've got 0 fourths, 1/4, 2 fourths, 3 fourths, 4 fourths, 5 fourths. I'm going to keep going until I get to 12. 6 fourths, 7 fourths, 8 fourths. That's a 4, by the way. 9 fourths, 10 fourths, 11 fourths, and 12 fourths. How many fourths does it take to make a whole? It takes 4, right? So let's divide this up into groups of 4. So here is 4 times 1/4. This would be 4 more times 1/4. So this would be 4, 8. I've got to do this one more time. 4 times 1/4. So now I've got 4, 8, 12. So I've got 12 times 1/4 is the same thing as 4 fourths, 4 fourths, 4 fourths, 3 times. 3 times 4 fourths, which is the same thing as 3 wholes. This is 1 whole, 2 wholes, 3 wholes. All right, now, multiply as shown below. Write the product as a mixed number. Draw a line to support your answer. So we're going to continue to do the same thing. We're just going to have a little bit left over, okay? So you can see here they had 7 copies of 1/3. That just means 7 times 1/3. That's all that means. So they did groups of 3, and then they had 1 left over. So we're going to do 7 copies of 1/2. That just means 7 times 1/2. So let's draw our number line here. And we're drawing halves, and I at least have to have 7. So I've got 0 halves, 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves, 8 halves. I only need 7, but we've got 7 copies of 1/2. How many halves does it take to make a whole? It takes 2. So we're going to do this in groups of 2, okay? So I've got 2 times 1/2. There's 2. I'm going to do 2 more. 2 times 1/2. That's 2, 4. Now I'm going to do 2 more. 2 times 1/2. That's 2, 4, 6. Now I can't do 2 more, so I'm just going to do 1 more half. So I've got 7 times 1/2 is the same as 2 halves, 2 halves, 2 halves, 3 times. So I've got 3 times 2 halves plus this half that's left over. So 3 times 2 halves is the same as 3 plus 1/2 equals 3 and 1/2. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at 10 times 1/4. So I'm going to have 10 fourths. All right, so I've got 0 fourths, 1/4, 2 fourths, 3 fourths, 4 fourths, 5 fourths, 6 fourths, 7 fourths, 8 fourths, 9 fourths, 10 fourths. How many fourths does it take to make a hoe? It takes 4, so I'm going to put these into groups of 4. So I've got 4 times 1/4. There's 4. I'm going to do 4 more. 4 times 1/4. So this is 8. Well, I'm only going to 10, so I can't do 4 more. I can just do 2 more. So here's my 2 fourths. So I've got 4 fourths 2 times. So 10 times 1/4 is the same thing as 2 times 4 fourths, because here's 4 fourths 1 time, 4 fourths 2 times, plus 2 fourths. Well, 2 times 4 fourths is the same thing as 2 plus 2 fourths, so this equals 2 and 2 fourths. Okay, let's try 14 and 1/3. All right, so I'm going to do 1/3 14 times. So I've got 0 thirds, 1/3, 2 thirds, 3 thirds, 4 thirds, 5 thirds, 6 thirds, 7 thirds, 8 thirds, 9 thirds, 10 thirds, 11 thirds, and I'm going to have to extend my number line here because I made it too short. All right, so now I have, let's make it a little bit longer. So I've got 12 thirds, 13 thirds, and 14 thirds. So how many thirds does it take to make a whole? It takes 3 thirds. So I'm going to group these in groups of 3. So 3 times 1/3. Then I'm going to do 3 more. 3 times 1/3. So that's 6. 3 times 1/3. That's 9. I can do 3 more. That's 12. 3 times 1/3. I can't do 3 more, but I can do 2 more. So now I've got 2 thirds. So I've got 3 thirds 4 times. So 14 times 1/3 is the same thing as 4 times 3 thirds plus this 2 thirds on the end. So 4 times 3 thirds is the same thing as 4 times 1 whole, which is 4, plus 2 thirds equals 4 and 2 thirds. Okay, I know that this was a lot of writing today, and I know that you really had to think about how many unit fractions does it take to make a whole. Just remember, if you get confused, to come back and check your problem set today whenever you are working on your exit ticket.